I grew up in East Germany, so obviously we were kind of very blocked from Western advancements, and that like actually meant computing hardware as well. Although I do remember East Germany like basically kind of like other countries doing it now, like basically copying schematics for hardware and like actually building basically the same hardware but in their own country, because you don't need to worry about patent right if you don't really follow it anyway. So I remember like my first real memories of computing were when a friend of mine whose father was like, had a really good position in a company, had a computer called the KC-854. And KC stands for client computer or small computer, which was basically a C64 hardware. But it was cool, it was extendable, you had like slots, you can like basically extend the RAM and stuff like that. And it had like a cassette drive, so you could actually listen to your programs and stuff like that. So anyway, I remember like going to my friend and it's like, what is this machine? It's cool, and it had like you could like boot up games and play stuff. And we were not very well financially, so like that was way out of my reach. But then kind of 89 was like a really important year, I guess, because the wall came down. Like without that like major political event, I would not be here today for sure. So it was a good year, although for me, at the time I was too young to really realize what the political implications were of those. But it was cool, I could go to West Berlin now and see all the flashy things, and it was all exciting and that's kind of crazy. And then like basically kind of because we were good friends with, or my parents were good friends also with the parents of my friend, like we basically kind of agreed like they were going to basically buy, or they were about to buy a proper PC, so they wouldn't need that East German computer anymore. So we said like, well, we're gonna buy it if you don't want it. And so basically, maybe 89 or 90 or something like that, we kind of then bought the computer for my friend, and I had that, KC-854, which was awesome. But it was a C64 basically under the hood, and I had friends at the time, then later, who got a C64s. So we kind of, when learning programming, we kind of learned, even though we learned on different machines, it's basically you had the same thing. You had like the assembly level, like native coding, which I totally didn't get at the time, and then the basic interpreter. And we could totally share information, even though we had completely different machines. And the reason why I learned programming is actually interesting because my dad is an electrical engineer. So he heard about what you can do with computing, of course, and he was always interested in this kind of stuff. And he brought home a book called like, Programming in Basic or something like that. And I think like even within like a few weeks, I completely like surpassed them on that. I was like, oh, that sounds cool. I don't know anything about it. And obviously as a kid you have way more time, so I just like was going on and hammering on it and drawing lines and stuff like that, and found it like incredibly fascinating. And like, it's like, I don't know why my dad stopped, but like I guess it wasn't really like for him to like the whole thing. It's like probably too far removed from the actual like underlying hardware. But yeah, I completely like basically started to take off, and I was like programming in Basic and stuff like that. It was awesome.
Do you still have that computer?
At home I do, yeah. At my parents' house it's still there, including which is really awesome, including the old like a little black and white monitor called Unist, which was a Russian like CRT monitor. Black and white, had like knobs to turn and stuff like that. So we had that, and I basically had my entire like desktop setup where I had the little monitor on top of the actual desktop computer and stuff like that. Yeah, I still have it there. I'm worried that all my programs going to be demagnetized now because they were on cassettes. But I found like maybe a year ago or so, I was Googling around and I found that there are people who preserved all of the major releases on MP3s. So you can like download it now and actually like put it onto cassettes and then get back. So I'm not too worried. Although what I probably have lost is all the programs I've written, which is kind of sad because that's actually where my adventure gaming kind of career started. Because at the time, my friend who had a 64, had floppies, and I remember he showing me like, Zack McCracken and like those super early kind of Maniac Mansion, like the super early like adventure games. And that was cool, it was like a story, and it's like kind of, we had to solve puzzles, and it was, really cool, and the graphics were awesome at the time as well. I kind of like took that and combined it with my, basic skills and was trying to like work on that. And I had heard about also text adventures, so I was basically trying to kind of, not trying, I was writing like text adventures, but like trying to augment that whole thing with like line graphics that are basically coded. So, I wouldn't like draw something, but I would say like, well, you're in a room, so I, would draw like, like rectangles nested in each other and lines to give kind of impression of like you're actually in a room. Like I guess I always had the dream that I wanted to do that. Like I always kind of wanted to write games or like be involved in visuals, and like for me at the time what completely blew my mind was like the dawn of the digital age for visual effects in movies, and like seeing those movies and realizing that this was done on like hardware, like somebody actually wrote code that created images that are basically photoreal back then, now not anymore, but just completely blew my mind, and I could just not understand like how that worked, and I kind of just had an urge to like find out how does that all work, and then Command and Conquer came out, and like those games had all like rendered cutscenes, and I was just completely swept away by all of that awesomeness.
At least your mother tipped well.
And I remember, I think a lot of that stuff, like my parents were very, very supportive. Like, other than, where other parents, said like, oh, don't waste your time with games. They were always like, they bought me a book called like, you make your own computer games. And it came with like POFRay, which is an open source like 3D kind of rendering package using like mathematical shapes. And then I started to basically use that to kind of like understand how 3D graphics work and how to, create this kind of visual fidelity. And I started to try to imitate like the kind of Command and Conquer style, like cutscenes and stuff like that, and just using mathematical shapes. And it was like incredibly fascinating, and like, and it actually like comes to like feeds into the fact that when I joined the games industry, I did actually not join as a programmer. When I was hired for, or got an internship for, was as an artist to become like a modeler, like an environment modeler. But I kind of also foolishly mentioned in that interview that I can also do C++. And then I think I never actually did any artwork for this company. And like since then, I've always been a programmer. But I think like going down that route and like going super deep also, like how is artwork created, like helped me always to understand how the artists work, and like that helped me to improve the tools and understand what needs to be done to kind of get stuff out of the door, and like in terms of art, yeah.
I mean, do you lament the fact that you don't get to do any art type stuff, or?
No, I love programming, I really do. And in these days, it's really not as clear-cut anymore. I worked as a graphics engineer, and that's really kind of where both worlds meet anyway, because you're basically writing mathematical equations that do end up becoming art. And every once in a while I can do something where I can use Maya and stuff like that, like for the kind of little trailer for Redbox reboot. And it was actually a really nice flashback to me, because like during university I did a bunch of like short movies and kind of like just in Maya and like doing that kind of stuff. So I kind of was able to kind of connect back to my roots and kind of like use all the stuff I learned back then, and kind of still like was able to figure out how that stuff works. So it's kind of fun. So okay, I'm jumping a bit, but so after I was kind of done with my first computer, I got a proper PC, and it was a 386, which had like a turbo button, which was awesome. But anyway, so at this point, basically, I kind of like went from programming basic to Turbo Pascal, which was kind of like higher level and like more powerful. And back then, I started to really embrace like actually trying to combine the skills, like creating artwork with programming. So one thing which was super big at the time were like Myst-style kind of adventures. So like first-person view, single like rendered kind of shots, super photoreal, and you could move around. And I wrote one thing I'm still kind of proud of is like I wrote an adventure game in that kind of style called Human Shock, because obviously my English wasn't very good, and it was about like something has happened on Earth and all the humans have disappeared, and so you're there alone and you're kind of like stranded, you need to figure out what's going on. And I created like this first section of the game where you basically have to navigate your way out of this room where you're locked into, and it was all, I like created all the artwork in this 3D software package that I bought. And then I basically wrote that in Turbo Pascal using like partially assembly code, partially like Turbo Pascal. And that was pretty cool. And the other day I was trying to get DOSBox running on the iPad, and the first thing I did, obviously, try to get my own adventure running. And it works. It's really awkward to control, obviously, without a mouse, but it still works, and that's kind of every time I see it, it's like I have to smile because it looks so weird now, but I still have like all those memories like sitting there and like, you know, typing in an exact pixel position of where something should be positioned and stuff like that. You know, I guess as long as I can remember, I always was kind of fascinated by adventures and like the ability to tell stories, you know, and kind of like express your ideas in that. It's always resonated very strongly with me, I suppose, yeah. And basically doing that, I was really trying very hard to find like a proper internship in a games company. And at the end of it, I was lucky enough to find a games company near where I lived, kind of Berlin area, called Terra Tools, that were actually doing an Xbox game back then called Urban Assault. And so I went there, and they kind of liked me, and you know, and I showed them mostly my artwork. I really wanted to become like, you know, an artist, and they said like, cool, yeah, like we can, you know, offer you an internship. We're not going to pay you much or anything, but you can come and you can sit here and do stuff. And I was like, great, this is the best thing ever. Because back then, you know, there weren't really any game studios in Germany. There were a handful, but most of them were more like in 1,000, so I couldn't really go there. So I did that, and like at the time, basically, I had a little gap between the military service end and like starting college. So I basically programmed that whole time through, like I basically just like, I went home during the weekend and stuff like that. But I enjoyed my work so much, like I just spent so much time. I learned so much in that company. It was fantastic. But then, you know, I started studying and I still contract worked for them, which was awesome. So they kind of like soon hired me as a full-time employee, which was awesome. But then kind of, I guess, my second year into college, the company unfortunately went bust because, you know, like it was end of .com bubble bursting and stuff like that. So they went under, and then I was like, well, what am I going to do now? And at this point, I kind of came back like, well, computer graphics is really awesome, and you know, I was just starting to go into computer graphics courses in university. So I went into the office of my professor, said like, here, I wrote this program which can, you know, ray trace stuff pretty cool, and I optimized it and it runs pretty fast. And he's like, hey, great, I've got a project for you. So then he hired me, and we basically did research on foliage rendering. And that actually, he must have pulled string, I don't know. Like, it was just really successful in the terms that, you know, I was able as a student to go and present at SIGGRAPH some of the stuff, which is like the biggest kind of computer graphics research conference. And it was huge, and I was completely overwhelmed. This was my first time going to the US, flying down to San Diego. And it's like just completely overwhelming. And I did the presentation in my broken English. I still remember people asking me questions there after my talk, and I couldn't really, my brain already switched off, so I couldn't really like answer. That's kind of weird. And then, so I did that, but then kind of, you know, finished my degree. And then I was like, all right, what am I going to do? Am I going to go like, you know, down the academic path and become a PhD? Or am I going to go back to industry? And at this point, I kind of felt like I'd done enough like graphics research work that I felt like, for me at the time, it was a bit too detached from actually making products. I felt like I want to go out and do stuff. And at the time, I was mostly interested in, you know, doing animated movies and stuff like that, and kind of just using computer graphics or like using programming to basically, you know, express art. And, you know, there was a time when Pixar released their, you know, big movies, and they became like super huge. And so I was like, well, that's, you know, something I want to do. Obviously in Europe, there wasn't much going on in this term, and I found this very, very small animation company in Scotland, in Glasgow. And I wrote them an email, said like, hey, I want to do an internship. And they said like, cool, yeah, come over. You can come over and you can, you know, have an interview, but we can't guarantee whether you're going to get the position. And I went there, and they got me, said like, all right, cool. Again, we're not going to really pay you anything, but you can come and like do work. And that was cool for a while, but like the company unfortunately was not as professional like as one would have hoped. And even though I really loved like Glasgow and the whole area, I kind of felt like, you know, this company is just like, I need to go away and like go in a bigger company and do like more professional things. And I was lucky enough to get a job at Sony in London. So I basically moved on to London, and I joined just at a time when basically the PS3 was getting ready for, you know, going out in the world. So I was hired basically as kind of like a system/tools programmer to work on, you know, PlayStation 3 and /iToy games. So, and that was awesome, and I had a lot of like really fond memories of that time. And I basically ran into people from LucasArts, which at the time were like really desperately trying to find engineers, because I guess after the .com bubble burst in the US, like people here, like kids basically stopped studying computer science, or not stopped, but a lot of people decided that there's no career path in like programming and any of that stuff. So there was a huge like dip in like people who with technical knowledge, and it left all the all the games companies over here with a problem, because now they have all this hardware and need to make those games, right? But they have nobody to program those, or not nobody, but were very difficult for them to find people. So they were increasingly trying to find people, in Europe and other parts of the world. And I went to one of the interviews and talked to the boss, and like, I guess I must have said something right, and they invited me to come here to San Francisco to interview at LucasArts. So they bought me a ticket and flew me over, and it was all pretty cool. And I immediately liked San Francisco because it was like, so laid back, and the weather was great. I was here like in September, which is the best time in San Francisco, of course. And the interview was great, and I basically talked to a lot of different people, and they weren't even like asking me much technical stuff, but I was lucky enough to like basically join kind of a third team that was trying to make a game that was neither Indiana Jones nor Star Wars. That was pretty good time, but then basically LucasArts the last couple of years has like kind of a shaky kind of time, I guess, because like during the kind of 2.5 years I was there, I saw 3 different presidents basically. So the management was like replaced multiple times, and that always comes with like layoffs and a lot of people being fired, and teams being rearranged and stuff like that. So I think only a few months after I joined, one of those things happened basically. LucasArts for the longest time would like not touch the old IP. And the reasoning in the management was like, we don't want to look back, we want to look forward. And it was like really our team that kind of, during those transitioning times where nobody knew what's going to happen, we were like, well, if we have no work, you might as well create something awesome. And a friend of mine basically dug out the old Monkey Island 1 source code, and we were starting to just look at that stuff. We had the problem for like stupid stuff. We realized, for example, that we couldn't find any of the source assets for the games. So all we had was basically the final like package data that went out on the disks. And so we had to basically write code to like decompile all the assets out of the packages, which is like a lot of what Scum VM does as well, like try to reinterpret the data. So we did a lot of that stuff. I was trying to recreate, like get that stuff out, and then so we can basically use this as templates to, upres that art and stuff like that. And we did found the source code, which was good, so we could like start working on putting it on iOS and stuff like that. And that was a really cool time. Like working on the Monkey Island Special Editions was great, and like I never thought that I was going to be working on something like that. And I still remember actually when I left London. And that's no joke. When I left London, I told people my one goal for going to LucasArts is to make them make adventure games again. And like for this short period of time, like there was hope that this might actually like happen, and it was cool. But being able to work on that game that I loved so dearly, and when I grew up, was absolutely fantastic. And we found old script files where there's still code comments from Tim that said like something like we should really fix that or something like that. At the time, it was actually cool because we were kind of asked to do more indie games. So they said like, well, LucasArts, is good at making big like AAA games, and you're really leveraging the big IP like Star Wars, but they're not very good at kind of like pushing the boundaries creatively, which they were great at like in the old days. So they said like, well, can you do something about it? And he said, sure. So we had the team I was working on basically trying to come up with like smaller short-term projects, but really trying to push it creatively. Unfortunately, not many of those really made it out. The one that did make it out in the end was Lucidity, which was kind of like a reverse platforming game, and very heavily concentrated on art style and stuff like that to really create like a very cool mood for the game. So we did that, and then management changed again, so then we didn't do that anymore. And then basically, I kind of had like a period where there wasn't really anything for me to do, I guess, so they kind of shoved me off a bit in the edge, and it's like, here, just find some work. And I was kind of really depressed because, that's not what I want to, that's not why I came. I want to make cool stuff. I don't want to sit in the corner and like write some like tech that nobody's going to use anyway. And I was really depressed, and then I was talking at the time, trying to find some other jobs, and I wasn't really successful, not really finding anything that really resonated with me. And then talked to a friend of mine who was working at Double Fine at the time, and more specifically working on the Once Upon a Monster game. And he said, like, why don't you come and just see the studio? It wasn't even like have an interview, just like come see the studio and see if you like it. And I came in and like, it was just like such a difference, like coming into Double Fine where people, were just sitting there and are actually like making games and enjoying what they're making and really believing what they're doing. And just, it's like such a difference coming in, like people with sparkling eyes, like, look at this, and I made this, and it looks awesome, and look how funny that is. And it was just, it was really like awesome. And I said like, yes, I can totally see myself working here. And then I came for the interview, and that was interesting. It was like entire day, like 8 hours or something like that. And mostly like not even that many like technical questions, mostly like just personality screening, which, over the years I learned that I think one of the really important things to form a really successful team is really to make sure that the people that are going to be on that team really work well with each other, and that's like super important. And I think that's what happened. And so I talked to artists, programmers, everybody in the company basically in the day, and at the end was Tim Schafer. And obviously, I was a big fan of Tim, and I saw him at GDC once, but I never really talked to him. And he came in with his iPhone, and at the time LucasArts just released the Monkey Island special editions that I worked on. And he came in, it's like, hey, I'm playing your game. And I said like, well, I think you're more playing like your own game there. And so that was cool, and I talked to Tim, and then I got hired, which was awesome. Yeah, I mean, if someone would have told me like, 20 years ago that not only going to be like working on Monkey Island 1 to bring that like to a new generation of gamers, I actually will be working with Tim Schafer on a new adventure game, I would have absolutely laughed, because it's like ludicrous back then that somebody would make a new like high-profile adventure game. So yeah, I'm just like incredibly lucky, really, that this worked out, and I'm super happy. It's great. And from what I seeing so far from Tim's design and the story, and it's really great, and it's super funny. It's like just like in the old days where playing Monkey Island. I still remember the one puzzle in Monkey Island is like probably like the greatest moment in games for me is in the mansion. You have a section where you try to basically steal something from the governor's house, and you go into that room, and like so you can't actually see Guybrush anymore, and he's kind of behind the wall, but you kind of see the game being executed for you. So like basically kind of scripts like Guybrush use the wax lips on this, and it's basically a scripted sequence, and it's like so funny. And I remember playing that for the first time, just completely laughing all the way through. And I really hope that you kind of get to something like that where people are just like getting immersed and like really connect with the characters, and like have just an awesome experience and kind of really feel with the characters. And if something funny is happening, they will laugh and stuff like that. So that's really my hope. But I think we're gonna get there.